In times of crisis, people tend to look for guidance, and we've certainly had our fair share of crises over the past couple of years. But even for those not directly affected by any of them, there's also the pressing question in the background whether the worst crises are still ahead of us, and this seems to be more of an elusive feeling rather than something tied to a specific threat. Sure, climate change may be one of them, and nuclear warfare is another popular one, but it can be hard to put your finger on it where exactly this fear of the future is coming from. I've just heard it spelled out by a friend of my brother's as the general prediction: for one of the generations in the near future, fit will hit the shan. We're really talking about a mindset here, a notion of having given up on the realistic possibility of progress. And this is reflected in the narratives, the stories we tell ourselves. We seem to be stuck in some sort of cultural stagnation, caught in a loop of remakes and reboots, or sequels that nobody asked for, adaptations of older works of fiction, rather than genuinely novel ideas inspired by the current writing on the wall. Sometimes these adaptations or remakes even completely undermine the original intended message of the work in question. Then, of course, there's the whole subgenre of post-apocalyptic stories. At best, these stories have noble dark settings, people trying to be good in a dark world, but at latest in the wake of Game of Thrones, grimdark settings seem to have become much more popular. Grimdark settings, especially when combined with the sci-fi genre rather than the fantasy genre, come with a corrosive combination of a future that looks even worse than the present, thus reinforcing the idea that one of the future generations will be doomed, b, the arrogant notion of framing their pessimism as inherently more realistic than hopeful stories that seek to inspire positive change, and c, their claim to realism is often especially pronounced with regards to the way they choose to depict humans as they supposedly really are. This may not have been the original intention of grimdark as a genre. In the 1990s, grimdark stories being available in parallel to utopian and hyper-optimistic stories like Star Trek: The Next Generation may just have served the purpose of catharsis. Like a cold shower before you return to your nice and cozy home, now feeling better about your own life, no matter how mundane, because at least it's better than what these guys have to go through on a daily basis. But when the cold shower already is your reality, or looks like it might become your reality very soon, being surrounded by grimdark stories just fosters a mindset of learned helplessness. Not only do you feel clueless and without guidance yourself, it also seems like everyone around you is similarly lost and overwhelmed by the challenges they personally and humanity at large are facing. Curiously though, for all the apocalyptic stories we have, few of them seem to be about realistic apocalyptic threats. Instead, the zombie apocalypse and the takeover of artificial intelligence reign supreme. I guess a story set in a world after 3 or more degrees Celsius worth of global warming, that would hit a little bit too close to home. Or a story set in a world after an asteroid impact, a solar flare, or a gamma ray burst. Such a story wouldn't even have to be all that dystopian. I mean, hey, just a few days ago, NASA made a huge step forward in protecting Earth from future asteroid impacts. Fostering some more public awareness of our ability to defend ourselves against one type of apocalypse might also boost our self-efficacy, our trust in our ability to deal with other types of existential threats too. Perhaps we could use a few more films like Armageddon and fewer Mad Max Fury Roads. But of course, Armageddon is over 2 decades old by now, just another of the many stories from the optimistic 90s. From a time when Star Trek Deep Space Nine was already considered edgy and dark in comparison to TNG. In contrast, stories that attempt to be progressive nowadays tend to concern themselves with identity politics and other literal micro-problems rather than addressing the big threats we're facing. And perhaps that's part of the problem. The actual, serious threats are just too big. Thus, obsessing about microaggressions might just be the progressive's equivalent to a conservative caring about their own local community first. And cleansing their own history of what they perceive as bigotry would then be their equivalent of starting with cleaning up their own room. Yet it's precisely the self-identified progressive stories that seem to contain the majority of the misanthropy that reaches its pinnacle in grimdark. Characters who are constantly in a bad mood, fighting with and picking on each other, some of them engaged in narcissistic pursuits of proving their own excellence to others. When even a goofy and harmless show such as Glee can be ruined by pretty much all of its characters turning into entitled, self-absorbed wannabe stars, obsessed with their own greatness on the grandiose side, and only revolving around their own personal luxury problems on the vulnerable side, then you can imagine what happens when characters with a similar mindset are thrown into much harsher conditions with real problems where much more is at stake. On the flip side, there is a pushback against heavy-handed messaging in stories, particularly in movies and comic books, and most famously by the community of the fandom menace. The gist of the demands basically boils down to, aside from respecting the characters and setting of established franchises, focusing on telling a good story first and having a message second, or not at all. But since the majority of the fandom menace are viewers and readers, not authors, with a few notable exceptions, they hardly spell out explicitly what they mean by a good story. I would assume that nowadays at least some of them mean an engaging plot. But plot is not synonymous with story. Abby Emmons here on YouTube explicitly distinguishes them as plot is about what happens, story is about how what happens transforms the characters. In other words, plot is just a chain of events, by itself just a sequence of random things happening. It's in the story where we find character development, that's where we find personal growth. And depending on the state the character ends up in as a result of that development, in a good or a bad place, that's where we find the message of the story, which can be told by a positive character arc, thus creating an inspiring story via a positive example, or by a negative character arc, as in a lot of the classic tragedies, to create a cautionary tale via a warning example. And those teachings are of course the main value that people like Jordan Peterson, whose fanbase overlaps with that of the Phantom Menace quite a bit, are looking for in stories. As most of you will probably be aware, Peterson mainly looks for ancient wisdoms in religious stories, but not all myths are religious stories, or perhaps they were once, but they no longer are. People can enjoy myths and the characters within them without still worshipping any of them as deities. I mean, just look at the two characters presented on screen right now. Only one of them is still being worshipped, but the other one receives a lot more donations from the offer tree. The German Wikipedia page for the word myth contains an interesting sentence which I will translate as, "Myths make a claim of validity for the truth they postulate." I have to translate this, rather than directly quoting it, because the English version of the article doesn't contain this concise statement. Instead, the English Wikipedia page begins its introduction with a bunch of cautionary disclaimers, that a lot of religious adherents regard their own myths as truths, and how some scholars therefore choose not to use the term anymore, basically to avoid offending religious people. Yeah, great. We just got started and already political correctness is impeding our ability to think and speak clearly. However, I can't let the opposite side off the hook here either, because one reason for these confusions between myths and truths is indeed that we've allowed ourselves to play bait and switch games with the word truth. This is especially ironic when it's done by some of the very same people who otherwise warn about the danger of redefining words. And it's not like we didn't have enough alternate terms at our disposal. The moral of a story, the lesson, the wisdom, or maybe the teachings, the insight we can obtain from them, or simply the ought. Every single one of these terms seems better suited to describe the value that myths have to our lives than the word truth. Because the word truth, in a colloquial sense, means something very different. The cold hard facts, reality as it is, or at least as we can measure it, reliably, objectively, validly. Truth in a colloquial sense describes the is. If we simultaneously use the word truth to refer to the message of a story or myth, even if we don't personally agree with that message, we're already conceding ground to the claim of validity that the myth makes. Wouldn't we be more precise in our word choice if we refer to a given behavior as, say, evolutionarily viable? Because that would include the reference by which we judge a given behavior as functional or not. And that reference is important, because as I've outlined in my previous video, Metaphorical Truths of Well-Being, a behavior can be true with regards to survival without being true with regards to well-being, and vice versa. Those just being two examples of different references that can be in opposition to each other. There may still be more. While most philosophers will agree that you cannot logically get an ought from an is, modern religious voices now seem to be attempting the opposite, getting an is from an ought. They're trying to make the case that just because the moral teachings of, say, a given biblical story are quote-unquote true, therefore also the God postulated by that story, and by extension the Bible as a whole, must be true. And that conversely, without such a religious entity, people would consequently also lose the guidance that the associated myths provide. Without this very specific God, so the claim often goes, society would slide into nihilism. And the more dominant religious voices become in the conservative political domain, the more nihilism becomes the greatest boogeyman. Yes, an even greater boogeyman than communism. At this point, it's almost the gotcha weapon of the right. Basically, their equivalent to the left calling somebody a racist. Nobody wants to get called a nihilist, because if that accusation sticks, nobody seems to have come up with a clever retort yet. The only way to escape it is to deny and vehemently refute the accusation as soon as it has been made. As far as I can tell, though, this obsession about the supposedly impending or ongoing threat of nihilism seems to be a fairly recent concern among conservatives. I remember how, just a few years ago, most members of the new political right still refer to themselves as atheists and as skeptics. They weren't trying to feed you any religious convictions, they just garnered a bunch of views by ranting about wokeness. But because the rise of conservatism is in large part, as Stephen Fry put it in the Monk debate, less due to their own merits and more because of the quote-unquote catastrophic failure of the left, the updraft for the right will continue, including for the religious advocates, for at least as long as the left continues to hold on to wokeness. For example, Dennis Prager from PragerU recently said on Tim Pool's podcast that his primary goal is to convince people of the need for a god, rather than of God's existence itself, assuming that once you're convinced of the need for a god, you will accept the rest yourself. And this is indeed something I've seen play out with some of these former right-wing atheists, such as Dave Cullen from Computing Forever and The Dave Cullen Show. It looked like they reasoned themselves back into being religious because they had bought into the claim that you needed religion to uphold a certain set of values. The assumption of nihilism being a prevalent problem in the current Western world gets thrown around so much that it can easily become another one of those snug premises, an unquestioned agreement between all parties involved in a debate that people will often just accept without even noticing that somebody just smuggled this claim into their argument. But the more I've been thinking about it, the more I've come to the conclusion that nihilism might be the wrong diagnosis. We're not suffering from nihilism, we might just be experiencing the symptoms of worldwide pluralism. Specifically, when you consider what the supposed nihilism is commonly attributed to, science, the Enlightenment, rationality, then globalization, then the internet, the question arises whether the problem is caused by something we lost, as those who see nihilism everywhere like to claim, or whether it instead arose from something we gained, additional perspectives. Whereas in former times, you would mostly only be exposed to the opinions of your immediate local community, now everyone around the globe, with varying degrees depending on their level of technology and the quality of the internet access, is being exposed to the views and opinions of people from the other side of the globe on a daily basis. That means more conflicting information and, much like you can browse Netflix for an entire evening without ever settling for one specific thing to watch, can lead to choice overload. If that is the case, the problem wouldn't be so much with an absence or lack of meaning, but rather with an overabundance of it. There are plenty of offers for both religious and secular frameworks available that anyone could choose to attach their own subjective sense of meaning to, and every single one of them is just one Google search away. This of course places the responsibility to find one's own meaning in the hands of the individual, so this is an existentialist perspective. You're condemned to be free and have to choose your own source of meaning rather than being handed one. But it's not like you have to come up with a sense of meaning all by yourself, as much as I would personally prefer it if more people did that, because of course, all of these pre-established sources of meaning, religious and social movements alike, come with a good dose of built-in groupthink. Of course, the religious will complain that the secular sources of meaning are man-made, social constructs, as their progressive advocates will call them, and that therefore they cannot provide an objective moral standard. Again, this is another snug premise that the religious right relies on to go unquestioned. If you examine it, you realize that they're holding secular people to a higher standard of meta-ethics than themselves. Alex O'Connor, aka Cosmic Skeptic, has done a great job at spelling out how morality can't be objective, even if there is a god. So yes, secular frameworks cannot provide an objective moral framework, but neither can religion. This is not a tu quoque fallacy, because the secular rarely ever demand from the religious that they should provide an objective moral standard. Instead, this is a requirement the religious like to place on the secular, without realizing they are not merely failing to meet this requirement themselves, they also might just be asking their ideological opponents to do something impossible. Those who insist on religion consisting of timeless values are often oblivious to the extent to which their own religion's values have been continuously adapting and changing over time. Among others with regards to attitudes towards slavery, which the Bible openly endorses at several points, views on male-female relationships, on homosexuality, and on abortion. So when religious advocates today are bemoaning the absence of an objective sense of meaning or morality, they're yearning for something that never existed in the first place. On a similar note, as some societies today are dreaming of the past greatness of their empire, longing for a supposed paradise lost that was never as ideal as they imagine it in hindsight. What religious conservatives perceive as missing is merely the former comfortable certainty that their personal beliefs are the correct ones. As outlined before, in the absence of the free and rapid exchange of information enabled by globalization and the internet, the only opinions you'd have to contest with are those of other people in your local community, who are bound to have more in common with you in terms of values, even to this day, than people from the other side of the planet. That's also one reason why villages in the countryside tend to be more conservative than the big cities. Fewer people overall, fewer people with different cultural backgrounds, therefore also fewer people with drastically different opinions, and thereby fewer pesky challenges to your own personal, neatly established worldview. With that out of the way, just because pluralism might not be as destructive as genuine nihilism, that doesn't mean myths aren't still important to provide people a common set of values and ideals as guidance. In fact, it might even be more difficult to establish a common myth in a pluralistic society than in a nihilistic one. The values of a nihilistic society would just be like an empty canvas. It's easy to paint something new onto it. And most likely people would gladly jump onto the train of the first person who does so, being desperate for guidance as they are. This of course sets a society up to be easily exploited by ideologues, usually in form of the strong male leader, appealing to our inner ape, because they can fill that void with their personal convictions. A pluralistic society is more resilient against such manipulation, since everyone within it already has some preconceived notions and pre-established values, and they merely differ from person to person. On the flip side, this also makes such a society more resistant against any positive changes, because those require people to break their already existing bad habits. So if you want to create a new common guideline for a pluralistic society, you don't have the luxury of having an empty canvas to paint on at your disposal. You have to cut through the thicket of the jungle to carve out a new path, guiding people through that which has already grown, while also preventing some particularly naive travelers from going off onto side tracks that lead them to a dead end. Speaking of the pre-established values in society that form the thicket of this jungle, you may have noticed that we already have a bunch of myths that are actually way older than those derived from the religions which are currently still being actively practiced in our societies. For example, the stories from Greek mythology are still alive and well, and continue to be wildly popular, still inspiring movie adaptations to this day. Not only that, but we also have plenty of expressions derived from those stories, which wouldn't work as tools for communication because people wouldn't understand them if they weren't still familiar with those stories. Take, for example, a Herculean task, which is not to be confused with a Sisyphean task. Hercules' trials were strenuous, but ultimately worthwhile. A Sisyphean task, in contrast, is a punishment, infinitely hard, yet infinitely useless. Two further terms, which are of course linked to each other by the same myth, are Odyssey and the Trojan horse. And the Trojan horse, in turn, may be used as an image in speech in similar contexts as the idea of opening Pandora's box. You're inviting trouble into your life by doing something out of naivety or greed. Then there are also verbs like to tantalize, which is derived from Tantalus' torments, which were a punishment for hubris, in a similar vein to the Sisyphean task. In German, we also have the verb bezirzen, which is a synonym for to seduce or to misguide, and is derived from the mythological sorceress Circe. I could go on and on here. The point is, the myths are still alive and well, but the gods that once inspired them, not so much. People have already proven themselves capable of saving the baby in the bathwater. They can hold on to a mythological story perfectly fine without having to still worship any of the deities postulated within it as if they actually existed. Finally, there are non-religious myths, and some members of the fandom menace explicitly refer to them as such. These myths may still use similar patterns as certain religious stories. As Jordan Peterson pointed out when discussing Harry Potter on Flagrant Clips, this might even be especially the case the less space those religious stories and the systems of faith that created them take up in our daily lives. But the discussion with Flagrant Clips then ended in the conclusion that basically all we can do to tell good stories is to re-narrate the Bible in novel form. First of all, I think that's giving the Bible too much credit, if only because it singles out the Christian myths from the ancient Greek myths we've just discussed. But secondly, this assumption also contains the hubris to believe that all good stories had already been told, and that the lessons contained in biblical myths are not just timeless, even though we all can probably think of at least one biblical story that we no longer consider an adequate moral lesson for the current age, but also that the collection of these supposedly timeless wisdoms is definitive, that it already contains all the lessons we'd ever need to know. This would require the original authors of the myths to already have known in advance all the complex challenges we are ever going to face. Sure, if you believe your religious scripture was literally written or dictated by an omniscient god, at least that conclusion would be logical even if the premise is not. I guess that is why we see a similar notion with the Quran, which Muslims assume to be the final word of God, with Muhammad having been the final prophet, no further updates after that. Ultimately, though, that's just another form to set yourself up for the very same cultural stagnation we currently find ourselves in. At least Christianity had a built-in updating function in form of the Pope, acting as God's supposed representative on Earth. Jordan, however, doesn't seem to assume any divine authorship for the Bible. He explicitly mentions that the stories within it were compiled by human beings across centuries, to which his interview partner from Flagrant Clips says that the Bible is a best-of mythological stories. I can go along with that image, but of course there's still a huge difference between a best-of and a definitive collection of myths. Some lessons may simply not have been told in form of a story yet, or were never told in form of a religious story until a secular pop culture myth came along to do so instead. Find me a story, even a religious one, that hammers home the connection between power and responsibility in a better and more straightforward way than Spider-Man. Stories about temptation may be a lot more common in the Bible, but that still doesn't mean that younger stories can't make the same point in a less confusing way. Take Eve's temptation at the Tree of Knowledge, for example. Do you want people to derive from that as one possible conclusion that pursuing knowledge is bad? That being aware of what is good and what is evil is bad? I thought knowing what's good and what's evil was precisely the reason we were engaging with religious myths and the moral messages they contain in the first place. Even if that was most likely not the intended message of this myth, it's one of many possible ways people could understand it. And since the authors are dead, the death of the author is indeed the standard we have to use here. We can't go back to ask for the interpretation according to authorial intent. In comparison, the characters in Star Wars or Harry Potter that are tempted by the dark side of the Force, or of magic respectively, pursue something much more outrageous than knowledge, immortality, or, on a related note, the power to bring somebody back from the dead. That's a much more extensive power, which therefore comes with a lot more responsibility, or on the flip side, if somebody fails to use such a power responsibly, it contains a lot more potential for abuse and corruption. Even a story like The Lord of the Rings, which is heavily based on Christianity, by itself is still a non-religious myth, because in contrast to the actual stories of the Bible, nobody ever made the claim that Middle-earth was a real place, or that Frodo, Aragorn and co. really lived, or did any of the things the story says they did. Imagine what would happen if all Christians turned into atheistic but die-hard Tolkien fans. Religious values without the majority of the historical baggage included in religion? People focusing all on the message of the myth itself, rather than trying to prove that the big bearded man in the sky might indeed exist? Instead of church, they would attend a fan convention with other people who are just as well versed in the Bible, I mean in the Silmarillion, as their fellow believers. There they would find the community they value so much, a community that shares the same myth as them, and then they would all go home again, fully aware that, at the end of the day, the myth that gives them meaning is still a fictional story. While we will certainly find some religious stories that contain messages most of us would no longer consider appropriate or functional for our current day and age, the same can of course be said for certain non-religious stories. I'll elaborate on this further in the follow-up video to this one. But in short, I would pretty much put any story in there that features an archetypal nice guy as its male protagonist, at least if that nice guy achieves any type of romantic success by either remaining or actively becoming a nice guy. That myth has been busted in plenty of discussions by now, so it's time our stories start to reflect this realization consistently. Of course, some stories had already figured out long ago that the nice guy approach isn't particularly successful, by showing a character who attempts this approach and fails. Yet these stories don't always go the extra mile beyond that to show the viewer what to do instead. This is where the Crimson Capsule comes in. However, it's a double-edged sword. It can provide guidance and orientation, or it can just tear down the old framework of values, even if those values were based on a comforting lie, without replacing them with anything new. I've mentioned in a previous video how the colors of the pills often get mixed up with the colors of the American political parties. And since nihilism is the new boogeyman of the right, of course that's what they like to paint their opponents as. But I've also described in a previous video how the Crimson Capsule has nihilistic qualities, perhaps even more so than the blue one. That's because, as I said in my video on determinism, reality is inherently nihilistic. By itself, it doesn't provide any guidance to act in any particular way. The blue-pilled romantic, religious or not, can at least easily find a purpose in man's ultimate religion by worshipping the mortal goddess, to use some of my own imagery here from my song Bastion of the Divine. The Crimson Capsule, meanwhile, is the thing that tears down this last bastion of the divine, without offering an immediate alternative. Now not even romantic relationships, the bread and butter of most fictional stories, can necessarily be relied upon as a source for meaning anymore. And if you turn to those conservative voices who try to fill the void left behind by the Crimson Pill with religion and family values, well, then you're still just reverting back to the old ways, because that's all they have to offer. The white pill that some describe their rediscovery of religion as, white meaning a source of hope, is ultimately still blue on the inside. If you choose to believe in imaginary beings and act as if they were real, you're just swapping one comforting lie for another one. In its purest form, the skeptical, scientifically minded Crimson Capsule, the willingness to question everything, will always concern itself with the realm of the is first and foremost, not with the ought. Perhaps that's one of the reasons why it seems to be the Crimson Capsule community in particular who are so concerned about nihilism. They've already questioned the majority of their values and beliefs, so now they're facing the existentialist challenge of having to find a new subjective meaning, one they might have to craft all on their own. Anyone else, meanwhile, who still has at least one comfortable illusion to hold onto, can still find meaning and fulfillment in that, even if it might be based on a lie. Sorting out the lies from the stories we tell ourselves is important, so that we don't base our actions on misconceptions and end up running off for miles and miles into the wrong direction. However, that seems to be where the conservative critics of today's notion of progress seem to be stuck at right now. Don't go down that road, dear progressive, that's a bad place to be. Yet when asked for an alternative vision of the future, all they have to offer is the way back home, family, the place where it's safe. But in terms of the hero's journey, that's the refusal of the call to adventure. If the old ways were still working, more people would be sticking to them. As long as there is no external conflict that forces us to change, we can afford to keep sticking to our previous ways. That's the very definition of every fictional character's comfort zone, and the main purpose of the plot is to push the character out of it. Only by confronting an external threat is the character forced to change and grow. As Peterson pointed out, this change may require a part of you to die, quite literally perhaps, if we're talking about the death of certain neural structures within our brains. Yet, pretty much nobody likes to do that voluntarily. That's why the refusal of the call stage of the hero's journey is so important. It humanizes fictional characters, reminding us that they, just like us, don't want to have to change either. But after the refusal of the call comes the inciting incident, and it pushes them out of their comfort zone anyway. Our inciting incident has long arrived. In fact, it may already have been here 1 or 2 decades ago. Conservatives are now increasingly calling progressives nihilists and try to blame them for our collective disorientation. Meanwhile, those conservatives claim they can offer us guidance, but just like the rest of us, they don't know the road ahead. All they know is the way back home. Instead of confronting the dragon, perhaps the biggest one humanity had to face thus far, and one we keep feeding on a daily basis, they're asking us to run away from it. Don't try to save the world, focus on your local community. Clean your room. It's Germany in 1848 all over again. The Biedermeier folks retreat into private life, the young protesters are out on the streets, except the nationalists of back then are the globalists of today, and the corporate establishment plays the role of Prussian King Frederick William IV, pretending to place themselves at the forefront of the revolution, while actually fully intending to let all of the momentum go to waste in order to preserve the status quo. And there we have the feeling of stagnation I was describing in the very beginning. The thing is, of course, the plot will keep going whether we want it to or not. We are past the inciting incident on the road of trials, challenges, and temptations. And we all can see where the journey is going. The disaster plot point is as crucial an ingredient to every story as the inciting incident. Yet it's also precisely the one thing you're trying to avoid by learning from a story. The old writer's wisdom, show don't tell, is essentially just another way of saying he who will not hear must feel. Fictional characters pretty much all fall into the category of those who won't hear, because they usually hang on to some kind of misbelief. That's why they have to learn from their own mistakes. The wise man, however, as they say, learns from the mistakes of others. That requires him to hear before he is forced to feel. To acknowledge the herald of reality, the truth, before reality hits him in the face. If the hero already knew the lesson the story tries to teach him before he reaches the disaster plot point, that's the only way he could indeed avoid the disaster before it happens. So hopefully by now I've been able to convince you why we need myths, even if we might not need gods to get there. Or conversely, why we don't actually need gods for guidance, even if we can still make use of their myths. Like many others, from both the Phantom Menace and Jordan Peterson's following, I've recognized the problem, but I still see far too few working towards a solution. Especially Hollywood seems just as incapable of learning from the fan feedback as it's been a few years ago, probably because the bubble they live in is still just as impenetrable. This may of course be a good thing for all those fan review channels that pretty much single-handedly make a living by tearing woke Hollywood trash to pieces. I mean, there are channels out there who basically survive on making the same video ranting about The Last Jedi over and over again. And I assume I don't have to name any names here, Star Wars fans will know off the top of their heads which channels I mean. It's always easier to complain about a problem than to fix it yourself, or even to just contribute to the solution. And ultimately, that just solidifies and perpetuates the problem of cultural stagnation. Hence, I for one don't strive to become yet another one of those fan review channels, even though it would probably be a great way to grow my channel, given how popular these reviewers seem to be and how there still seems to be room for newer ones. One of the reasons for that is that I don't actually enjoy watching as much as I enjoy writing my own stuff, be it music or stories. And I don't actually expect a lot of creative output from my fellow Crimson Pillars, because by mere virtue of self-selection, most of them seem to be libertarians or conservatives, while creativity tends to be a progressive thing, for reasons I'll expand upon in the next video. In fact, that was the reason I started making music about Crimson Pill topics. There still isn't that much art out there even entertaining these ideas, so perhaps now it's time to put all that practice from writing fanfiction in private to good use and do the same on the story front. Perhaps it's time to give myself the goal I want to write a story that's metaphorically true, but not just metaphorically true in the conventional sense, with reference to survival, metaphorically true with regards to well-being. I've explored the difference between these two approaches extensively in my most recent video. And in case you were wondering, this is indeed the primary reason I haven't uploaded anything to this channel in almost a year. I won't say too much yet at this point, but it's a sci-fi story set on a generation ship. I've mentioned in a previous video how I've always had a somewhat morbid fascination with that premise. I also knew the setting would allow me to explore pretty much all of the philosophical concepts that influence this channel. A spaceship on which several generations live out their entire lives, meaning that pair bonding and procreation are direct requirements for the mission to succeed. While there are a lot of generation ship stories out there already, a lot of them only seem to use such a ship as a setting for a story that's about something completely different. Few actually explore the ramifications of and ethical conundrums inherent in the premise itself. Yet, until 1 year ago, that was all it was for me, a premise, without any detailed characters or story yet. But then I stumbled across Abby's channel, which was the first one I had come across that really went into detail about thematic storytelling, rather than just covering the standard stuff about how to make your characters and plot engaging. That way, I also switched from Microsoft Word to Scrivener, and because I didn't want to take the risk of importing all my previous writing into Scrivener while I was still using the trial version, I needed something new to write to put the software to the test. So I just got started, and the whole thing kind of snowballed into a story large enough for an entire trilogy, plus a prequel storyline before that. Scrivener tells me I've written about 300,000 words for the story over just the past 12 months, alongside finishing up my PhD thesis. Just in case you're wondering how serious I am about this. The majority of that word count is in the first book, for which I've written about 260,000, and yet it's nowhere near finished yet. So yeah, clearly I'm a massive overwriter and will have to shorten everything by a lot once I'm done with the first draft. So now that we've fully arrived in do-it-yourself mode, in case you consider yourself an at least somewhat creative person as well, here are some of the many questions I've asked myself along the way. First of all, I want my story to be inspiring, but I also don't want to lie to people, meaning we have to find a balance between the harsh truths, the lessons that the characters, and by proxy the audience, have to learn, and the escapism that a lot of people seek to find in stories, and which is indeed another frequent demand of the fandom menace. When you want to add a little more inspiring optimism to your story, especially in sci-fi, you usually can't go wrong with a dose of 90s Star Trek. However, of course it's been 30 years since then. Science has advanced quite a bit in the meantime. So if we still want our story to have a grounding in reality, simply retreading old ground and riding the nostalgia train won't work. We have to adapt the parameters of our fictional setting to the currently known facts. For example, if you write a story that includes a romantic subplot, stop telling your readers comforting lies about male and female nature. If you write a story set in the future, don't simply ignore the current trends. A story set on Earth is not like one set in a fantasy setting. You can't world build from scratch, you need to start with what's already there. If your vision of the future is supposed to be believable, whether as an inspiring or a warning example, we need to be able to see how humanity arrived there in your story. How did we tackle climate change in your vision of the future? Did we slow it down, or did we just learn to live with it and keep adapting? Was there ever a World War III, or how close did we get to one? And if so, how was it avoided? And in particular, if you write a sci-fi story, stop blue-pilling people about methods of interstellar travel, the number of habitable planets out there, and the likelihood of encountering aliens. Of course, don't resign yourself to only current levels of technology, dare to be optimistic and extrapolate into the future, but do so based on current ideas for inventions, not based on wishful thinking. Try to put the science back in science fiction. Thanks to the internet, research has never been faster or easier. The main new challenge is that it's become harder to separate fact from fiction, reports from opinion, especially when writing about a particularly politicized subject. And speaking of opinion, just because Game of Thrones primed us all to think this way, dark and gritty is not a synonym for realistic, not in fantasy, and probably even less so in sci-fi. Misanthropy is an attitude, not a fact of life. If you're personally into grimdark but still want to write a story that contains some sort of lesson, perhaps you'll be good at writing negative character arcs. Again, take a clue from Greek mythology. Those stories are full of cautionary tales of characters who make the wrong choices and are punished as a result. That way you can still allow the audience to learn from those characters' mistakes. And if you do it right, the audience will even perceive the punishment as justified. Grimdark isn't corrosive when it has characters fail and die. Grimdark is corrosive when it punishes characters for doing the right thing. Because by mere virtue of exclusion, the only message that can send is indeed a nihilistic one. Bad things happen to good things happen to bad people, the universe doesn't care. Yeah, we know, but that's not the point. You can believe in a universe that doesn't care, and in people that do. Finally, don't obsess about your plot. Focus on how the events transform the characters, how they change and grow as a result. Because ultimately, that's what matters to the audience. What can they personally gain from this? What can they learn from this? This is one area where the fandom menace, despite their many valid points of good criticism towards the current big franchises, can lead you astray. Some reviewers, particularly when they want to tear a movie or episode to shreds, will focus on plot holes and other inconsistencies. This can lead some to believe that that's what made this given story bad. But the worst part about The Last Jedi was not the Holdo maneuver, as ridiculous as it was, but the character assassination of Luke Skywalker. And conversely, in Titanic, I already figured out as a little child that there would have been enough space for both Jack and Rose on top of that door. It still didn't stop the movie from resonating with people all around the world, because guess what? That scene contains the movie's metaphorical truth. And much like the first draft of my work-in-progress sci-fi novel, this video is already getting way longer again than I intended it to. That's why I'll stop here and save the rest for part 2, in which I plan to go into a lot more detail about all the problems I see with storytelling today, and why even movies and series that have proven themselves pretty popular with fans lately still don't quite seem to have what it takes to become, say, the next Star Wars, or the next Harry Potter, or more generally, the next modern myth. I'm of course still also planning to upload some songs again in the near future, but of course I haven't failed to notice that more people seem to be interested in my spoken thoughts than in my music. And since I'm currently busy working on the aforementioned sci-fi story, I don't see any particular reason to rush it with the lyric videos for the songs. Sometimes the challenge is just in finding appropriate images that are still in the public domain, but also sometimes I'm just not quite content with the mixing and editing of certain songs yet. So hopefully I can keep practicing and improving on that front, while the focus of this channel shifts a little more towards spoken presentations as a medium. I also want to widen the scope of topics a little bit, among others with this current story analysis angle, not just because it interests me personally, but also because I think this may be interesting to a wider audience. My core convictions haven't changed, subtle symbolic hints here on screen, or you can just check out my older videos, but much like some fandom menace channels can get into a rut of essentially making the same video over and over again, the same could easily happen to my channel with regards to these somewhat fringe philosophies. Also, since these philosophies tend to be more on the pessimistic side, but my current goal is to write an inspiring story, without throwing the pessimist realism out of the window, of course, I think I can do something more productive with my time on this channel than making people miserable. Because honestly, if a dose of nihilistic reality is what you needed right now, you wouldn't have to come to my channel first, you could simply turn on the news.